Hello and welcome to Unlock UPSC. Today we are diving deep into a major issue that's been in the news, the operational crisis at Indigo, India's largest airline. We'll be using today's key editorials to break down this topic, which is, and I want to emphasize this, incredibly important for your UPSC, UPPCS, BPSC, and other civil services exams.
So what on earth happened? I mean, this is a question that affected so many people across the country. We saw thousands stranded, hundreds of flights just gone. This whole situation really points to some much deeper systemic issues in our aviation industry. It's a fascinating story of how new safety rules, a really aggressive business model, and people, the pilots, can all collide. So let's get right into it.
Okay, here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at what actually happened on the ground. Then, we'll decode the new pilot rules that triggered everything. After that, we'll dissect the real reasons for the meltdown, look at the consequences for everyone, see how the authorities responded, and finally, we'll wrap it all up with a sharp analysis designed specifically for your mains exam. Right, first things first, we need to get a handle on the sheer scale of this problem. And I really want to stress this. This wasn't just, a few delayed flights here and there. This was a massive operational breakdown that brought the country's biggest airline pretty much to a standstill.
You could literally see the chaos unfolding on the ground. We're talking hundreds of flights canceled across the entire country. This, of course, created a huge domino effect. Major airports like Delhi, Mumbai, and Bengaluru were completely swamped with these impossibly long queues. You probably saw the pictures online. People just completely distressed, families stranded, reports of lost baggage everywhere. It was, simply put, a total mess.
Now, this slide gives us some really important context. 60%. Just let that number sink in for a minute. That's Indigo's massive share of the domestic market. So when an airline this big, which is basically the backbone of air travel in India, has a crisis, it doesn't just affect them. The shockwaves are felt across the entire system, hitting prices, schedules, and connections for everyone.
Okay, so that's the what. Now let's get into the why. How did we even get here? Well, every crisis has a trigger, a spark. And in this case, the immediate spark was a big change in the rules by India's aviation regulator, the DGCA. And these rules were all about making flying safer.
All right, the heart of this entire crisis really comes down to one thing, something called Flight Duty Time Limitations, or FDTL for short. Now, these aren't just suggestions. They are strict, mandatory rules, and their whole purpose is to manage pilot fatigue. It's all about safety, plain and simple, making sure the people flying the plane are well-rested and alert.
And this table really lays out the core of the change. The biggest, most impactful change, it's right there in the first row. The mandatory weekly rest period for pilots was increased from 36 hours in a row to 48 hours. On top of that, new limits were put on night flights. So the bottom line is, these new safety rules meant that each pilot was suddenly available for fewer hours every week.
But here's the thing, and this is really important. The new rules were just the spark. The fuel for the fire, well, that was already there, built right into the airline's own way of doing business. These new rules just exposed some major vulnerabilities that were hiding in plain sight.
Yeah, this wasn't just one thing going wrong. What we saw was a classic perfect storm scenario. You had these brand new, tougher safety regulations crashing right into a very specific, very aggressive business model. And all of that was made worse by some long-running issues with their pilots that were just bubbling under the surface.
So let's talk about Indigo's business model. On one hand, the pro, its success is built on this super efficient, low-cost model. They keep their planes flying as much as possible, which is great for keeping ticket prices down. But here's the flip side, the con. This model relies a lot on night flights and operates with a very small number of backup pilots. So while it's super cost-effective when everything is running smoothly, it's also incredibly fragile. It just has no room for unexpected problems.
And if you look at the numbers, they're pretty startling. They really tell the story of a system stretched to its breaking point. For its main fleet of Airbus A320s, Indigo needed 2,422 captains. How many did they have? Only 2,357. They were already short on pilots before the new stricter rules even kicked in.
And, as if that wasn't enough, you had this whole other layer of issues simmering just beneath the surface. For a long time, pilots had been raising concerns. There were allegations of being pushed to work beyond the legal duty limits. There was frustration over salaries not increasing, even when the company was making huge profits, around 7,000 crore rupees. There was this feeling that the airline was always pushing the boundaries of the safety rules. So, what happens when an airline this big has a meltdown? Well, it doesn't happen in a vacuum, that's for sure. It had serious, immediate consequences that spread like ripples through the water, affecting passengers, the government, and the entire aviation industry.
Just look at this number, over 40,000 rupees. Think about that, for a single, one-way ticket from Delhi to Bangalore. With so many flights canceled, the number of available seats just plummeted. Demand stayed high, and basic economics took over. Prices went through the roof, and it was the average passenger who paid the price.
Okay, so you have this massive nationwide disruption. The big question then becomes, what did everyone do about it? How did the government, the regulators, and the airline itself respond to try and get things under control?
So the response kind of rolled out in stages. First, on December 3rd, you had Indigo coming out and officially acknowledging the mess, offering refunds and waivers. Then, 2 days later, the regulator, the DGCA, stepped in. They gave some temporary exemptions to the new rules to ease the pressure, but they also launched an investigation. And finally, by December 6th, the government itself had to intervene, putting a cap on airfares to stop the crazy price surge.
But the thing is, you can't just magically create more pilots. A quick fix was completely off the table. Hiring a new pilot is a long, complicated process. They have to get something called a type rating for the specific plane they'll fly, which takes a lot of time and money. Plus, Indian rules have these very long notice periods, 6 to 12 months, for pilots who want to switch airlines, making it incredibly hard to fill gaps quickly.
And this isn't just a short-term headache. Aviation experts like Shakti Tuma are pointing this out. This quote is a really stark reminder that this is a long-term structural issue for the whole industry in India. We might not have enough pilots to meet demand for years to come, especially with these important new safety rules in place.
All right, let's pull all of this together now and look at it from an analysis perspective. For all of you preparing for your mains exam, this is the really crucial part, connecting the dots and understanding the bigger picture from a policy and governance angle.
What this all boils down to is a classic policy dilemma, a real balancing act. On the one hand, you have the absolute need to prioritize safety. That's a huge positive. These new rules reduce pilot fatigue and bring India in line with global standards. But, on the other hand, if you enforce them too strictly without letting airlines prepare, you get the negative, massive disruptions and higher prices for people. This is the core challenge for policymakers.
Now, for your exams, these are the golden nuggets of data you need to remember. When you're writing your answers, mentioning these specific figures, the 60% market share, the 36 to 48-hour rule change, the 40,000 rupee fare, the long notice periods, will give your arguments real weight and credibility.
And to build a truly great analysis, you have to think about all the players involved, all the stakeholders. You've got the DGCA, the regulator. You have the airlines, the operators. You have the pilots themselves, the workforce. Then there's the government trying to balance everything. And right at the center of it all are the passengers. Any good solution has to consider every single one of these groups.
So that leaves us with this big question, which is perfect practice for your mains. How do we find that sustainable path forward? How do we balance safety, the growth of the industry, and the interests of the consumers? Use the points we've talked about today, the facts, the core dilemma, the stakeholders, to build a really solid, well-argued answer. See you again tomorrow with an important editorial. For this, subscribe to the YouTube channel Unlock UPSC. Thank you.